Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum as it is now entered into its lower logarithmic regression trend line. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. For the first time this market cycle, ETH has entered into its lower logarithmic regression trend line. And it is occurring at the same time that ETH Bitcoin looks like it's entering into a massive capitulation. One of the things that we've said before is that ETH Bitcoin could enter into the potential final stage of its capitulation as the merge supply is reached, right? When the supply of ETH reaches the pre-merge supply, that could lead into the final capitulation for ETH Bitcoin. And you can see, in fact, that the supply of ETH, if you look at it as compared to where it was at the merge, it's now basically back to it. So you're basically having the supply of ETH reach the pre-merge supply. And at the same time, you're seeing ETH Bitcoin capitulate. And at the same time, you're seeing ETH dominance hit this trend line, which we've been talking about forever. Remember a long time ago, I said that ETH dominance would likely go to around 9 to 10%. Well, it just had a wick down to 9.23%, right? This is the same idea as Bitcoin dominance, right? Just reverse. Like instead of, going up, while Bitcoin dominance is going up, ETH dominance goes down. But then whenever Bitcoin dominance tops out, then ETH dominance would then start to likely go back up. But in this case, one of the things is a lot of people are wondering, why is this happening? Right? What's going on? A lot of people are blaming the tariffs. Now, I think that's misguided. I'm not saying that the tariffs don't have any effect. What I am saying is that we'll always come up with a reason to explain anything after the fact, right? After the fact, everyone will be like, oh, well, it's because of the tariffs. But do you guys remember what I told you guys last year? And this pattern has happened once again, and this time people are blaming the tariffs. What we said last year was that Ethereum tends to capitulate the month after the Bank of Japan raises rates. And we were noting, we did this whole section in the Ethereum dubious speculation video about Bank of Japan monetary policy. And we were talking about how they would likely raise rates in January, which would then lead to a February capitulation. Now, to remind you guys, the Bank of Japan raised rates in March last year. Do you guys remember that? They raised rates in March, and then ETH capitulated the following month, right, in April. And then the Bank of Japan raised rates in July, and then ETH capitulated in August. Now you're seeing the same thing happen once again. The Bank of Japan raised rates in January, and ETH is capitulating in February. So you essentially have the same thing over and over and over again, right? The Bank of Japan raises rates in March, and then that leads to an April capitulation, right? And then you had the Bank of Japan raised rates in July, which led to an August capitulation. And now it's the same thing. They raised rates in January, and now you're seeing a February capitulation, right? So it's the same thing that we talked about in this video over here, but because a lot of people weren't really expecting it, they're now blaming tariffs. And again, I'm not saying that tariffs don't have any effect on the market. I assume they do. But my point is that the market was more vulnerable to have a reaction like this because of the potential unwind of the carry trade. And that's what we talked about in that video back then. Now, you can always be right for the wrong reasons. We'll never truly know why ETH is going down, whether it is related to the Bank of Japan, whether it's related to tariffs, or whatever it's related to. But I think that it was at least a good story to tell, right? If the Bank of Japan raises rates, it leads to the unwind of the carry trade, which leads to a capitulation wick in the markets. Now, we've also talked about this view in other ways, not just through the lens of, Bank of Japan monetary policy. We've talked about it through the lens of what happened back over here as well when ETH basically had a triple top. You see that? and then it had slightly lower lows. But if you look in the 2016-2017 cycle, there was also sort of a triple top right here. And you could argue that ETH is doing something very similar once again, right? You have sort of a triple top, and then it's going back down to these lows. Now, the question is does it put in a lower low? In 2016, it did put in a lower low, right? You had sort of a low here, and then a lower low, and then a final lower low. So it's always possible that you do, in fact, get a lower low, potentially in February, or potentially by March. One of the things we outlined in one of the tweets I put out recently, we've talked about it a little bit right on the channel, is that if the Fed comes out in January, which they did, and they do not declare that QT is over, it could lead to ETH getting this drop in the market, right? And actually finally taking it to its lower logarithmic regression trend line. Now, because it's going to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, the argument would then be that the Fed could potentially justify quantitative or the end of quantitative tightening sometime in the coming months, potentially as early as March. Now, if the Fed does end quantitative tightening, then there would be a good chance that ETH Bitcoin would then more convincingly bottom out, right? That's the argument. That would more convincingly bottom out and not just continue to bleed forever. If you actually look at the weekly RSI on ETH Bitcoin, it actually kind of looks similar to last cycle, where you get sort of these trend line of a low, a lower low, and then another lower low. Maybe it's just doing kind of the same thing. Maybe it's like that, where it's already bottomed, or a little bit lower. But the point is it is getting extremely low, and I know it's going a lot lower than people were wanting it to go. And the reality is no one really knows exactly where it's going to bottom. My only point is to say, look, until quantitative tightening is over, there's always a chance that it could go lower, whether we want it to or not. I would have been happy with it bottoming at 0.03, but as an investor, I have to keep an open mind. And as data comes in, right, if you're looking at the market and you're like, well, technically QT isn't over, you have to be open-minded to these outcomes, right? You have to adjust to the data as it comes in. And I think the other thing is, with this drop, it's actually corresponding to a period where all Bitcoin pairs have sort of fallen back into this expanding broadening wedge, right? We talked about this broadening wedge previously, and we mentioned it a lot up here at the highs when everyone was calling for alt season, and now you can see it's back down at the lows. Now, historically, alt Bitcoin pairs go down to the range lows at 0.25 here, and even wicked below it right there. We still have not seen that yet. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen soon. There's been plenty of times where alt Bitcoin pairs have rallied off of this level before then dropping later on. So I don't really want to say that it has to happen immediately, but do know that 2 cycles ago, alt Bitcoin pairs hit the range lows as late as November of 2017. So even if it doesn't go down here in the short term, unless they alt Bitcoin pairs bounce, it doesn't mean they won't be down there sometime later on this year, especially if quantitative tightening just continues on for a much longer period of time than anyone's thinking. I think a lot of it depends on just how bad the sell-off is. I mean, if it's mostly contained to just crypto, the Fed's probably not going to really care that much. But if the stock market, gets a correction, we'll see just how much pain they're willing to tolerate before they try to step in and change things up. If you look here at the bull market support band for ETH, it's currently right around 3,000 or right around 3,100. In fact, both the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. One thing to consider, by the way, is if there is a reaction off this level. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because if you look at this higher low structure by ETH, you can see that it looks like it's potentially breaking down, but it also looked like that in August of 2024 as well, and then it didn't actually break down, right? Now, the difference this time is that it at least did hit the lower logarithmic regression trend line, which it came pretty close to in August, but it didn't actually do it. What I would say is this. If ETH gets back above this trend line here and stays, say, back above 2,700, then it could still go back up to the bull market support band at some point before ultimately coming to that decision. I think that the March meeting for the Fed is going to be somewhat interesting because, it's all the way out March 19th, which is about 6 weeks from now. you know? So I think there's two ways this could play out. One way is the capitulation wick is almost over or nearly over. Perhaps ETH USD has to get a little bit lower of a low than what it did over here, just to kind of complete the pattern. But I'm not saying that it has to play out like that. But one thing to consider is if it can hold support in the short term at this level, let's say it can get back up to 2600, and it does kind of like what it did back over here, right? If it does what it did over there, then it might just wait to see. It might try to hold on and wait to see if the Fed is going to start back or get rid of quantitative tightening. Oftentimes, too, during downtrends, you can get sort of these 2-week counter trend rallies as well. I think the thing for me to consider the most is that, during massive events like this, where you get large capitulations, it can lead to adjustments in monetary policy, right? It can certainly lead to those adjustments. In fact, the last time we had a capitulation wick like this for ETH, the Fed began to cut just a month later, right? In September, I believe. So drops like this can eventually lead to changes in monetary policy. And it kind of goes back to what I previously said. If you want to see ETH Bitcoin go up, right, the only way it's going to really go up is if you get a market correction first that can justify the end of QT, quantitative tightening, right? If you get that event, it can lead to that change. You guys remember me talking about that, where I was like, in order to see ETH Bitcoin go up, you need to see QT end. But you can't see QT end, quantitative tightening, until there's a market correction. And now maybe we're in that market correction right now that will eventually justify quantitative tightening actually ending and going into a sort of a different phase of the market cycle. So I think that's kind of the relevant thing right now is that, what if the cycle is just playing out like it did last cycle, right? Where you have to get that scare to get quantitative tightening to end. And I think a lot of times this cycle, people want to front run it and say, well, the Bitcoin dominance will go down just simply because it's this time of the year or this seasonal phase of the market, where in reality, the Cryptoverse is very much tied to monetary policy, and this should be proof as Bitcoin dominance just spiked all the way up to 64% in a post-halving year, right? In a post-halving year, Bitcoin dominance has still managed to go up, and the reason is because quantitative tightening never ended. Remember, this top over here by dominance didn't occur until quantitative tightening was over. So I think that's really what we're dealing with right now with ETH USD and ETH Bitcoin. And that's the reason why I think ETH Bitcoin took a big hit, is because QT hasn't actually ended. Now, eventually we'll probably go into a phase where Bitcoin drops, when Bitcoin does drop, ETH Bitcoin goes up. But that will happen more than likely on the other side of the Fed pivot from QT to something else. Until that pivot occurs, then it seems like the most likely outcome continues to just be that if Bitcoin goes up, ETH goes up less, and if Bitcoin drops, ETH drops more. It's brutal. Same thing happened last cycle. The reason why this cycle feels different is because it's taking a lot longer for this part of the cycle to play out, right? Last cycle, that phase was over by September of the pre-halving year. This cycle, it's February of the post-halving year, and that process is still ongoing, which is why I think it feels a lot worse this cycle than last cycle. You could also capture that in the advanced decline index of the top 100 cryptocurrencies and see that it's been putting in lower highs since 2021, which is very different from 2020 and early 2021 when the ADI was putting in higher highs and higher lows. I'll go down here if you want to read the description of the usage of this metric. You can pause the video and read it. But I think that's why this cycle feels different, is because altcoins just keep on bleeding back to Bitcoin, right? And you can actually go look at others Bitcoin and see the same thing, right? I mean, others Bitcoin, in fact, just put in a new cycle low, right? A new cycle low. So it kind of shows once again that maybe this cycle isn't all that different in terms of the drawdown. It just takes longer to see it, right? Last cycle, there was a 60% drop by others Bitcoin, a 6% rally, and then another 6% drop. Same thing's happening this cycle, right? 60% down, 6% up, and now it's almost 60% down. It's currently gone down about 54, 55%. So a lot of the processes are playing out. They're just playing out on a more grander scale than we saw last cycle. just like ETH going to the lower logarithmic regression trend line is playing out on a much grander scale than it did last cycle. Remember, last cycle, ETH USD also had a higher low structure that it held for a long time. And then eventually it broke down, but then it did again, it did go to new all-time highs. It just took a while, and that process didn't really start. The path for Ethereum to new all-time highs did not start until ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Now, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September of 2019, just after ETH USD broke below the higher low structure, right? So there's this higher low structure that ETH USD broke below, and then shortly after that, ETH Bitcoin bottomed. Now, again, I don't know if this is just going to be a wick or not, like it was in August. If it is like that, then the process might just continue for several more months. If it does break down, then that could actually lead to a more convincing bottom by ETH Bitcoin, especially if we can get the end of quantitative tightening associated with it. So I think it's important to realize that now that the drop is, happening, right? Now that the drop is happening, a lot of people are going to look at it and try to figure out why. They're going to say, well, it's because of the tariffs, or it doesn't really matter. But the reality, as we talked about several months ago, if you looked at, I know it's a crazy thing, right? But if you just looked at Bank of Japan monetary policy, every time they raise rates, ETH USD nukes the following month. And this time seems to be absolutely no different whatsoever. Okay? And I know it's been a long wait, right? I know it's been a long wait for ETH to go to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. And you can see the regression trend line has actually been catching up with where ETH is, which was one of the outcomes we saw. I mean, look, it easily could happen that way, where the regression line sort of comes back up to ETH and they kind of meet each other somewhere in between. And then you get sort of a macro higher low that then leads into a path to new all-time highs. That's what happened last cycle, right? You had a higher low structure, right? You had a higher low structure that then led into a macro higher low that then led to new all-time highs. It seems like you could argue something similar is playing out again. It's just that this phase of the cycle is taking a lot longer to play out, right? It's taking a lot longer to play out. It never stopped playing out, and the evidence of that, again, is on the Bitcoin chart, right? The evidence of that is on the ETH Bitcoin chart, because you can see that those never stopped going lower. But remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin didn't stop going lower until after ETH USD broke that trend line, right? It was after ETH USD broke that trend line right there, right? If you overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart, it was right after ETH USD lost that trend line. That's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed out. Okay? And it seems like it's almost happened a few times this cycle, or at least once back in August, but then it ended up just being a wick, right? And ETH USD got back above it, continued on, and then ETH Bitcoin continued to bleed. So I think this is the argument, right? If you want ETH Bitcoin to stop bleeding, then ETH USD would likely need to spend some time down here to then justify the end of quantitative tightening. If ETH USD gets back up here and hangs out back up here, then it might just continue to lead to the devaluation of ETH against Bitcoin. So it's such a brutal cycle, because in order for the ETH maxis to get what they want, which is for ETH to go up against Bitcoin, you need to see the Fed pivot from quantitative tightening to something else, right? I'm not saying it has to be QE, but just away from QT. But in order for them to pivot, you have to have a market sell-off that's more sustained and not just a wick. If it's just a wick, there's no reason for quantitative tightening to end, because you could argue the market can handle it. If it's more than a wick, right? If it's more than a wick and ETH continues to slowly drop for another month or two, that could justify the end of quantitative tightening, and then people finally get what they want, right? The ETH maxis finally get what they want, and they get to see ETH Bitcoin go up. But as we've always said, right, in order for ETH Bitcoin to go up, you have to have pain in ETH USD. If you get the pain on ETH USD, it'll allow the Fed to pivot from QT to something else, maybe QE, maybe not. But if that pivot occurs, ETH Bitcoin can bottom, and then ETH Bitcoin can go up, and then therefore ETH USD might have a more plausible track to new all-time highs. Remember, ETH USD also did not go to new all-time highs last cycle until after ETH Bitcoin bottomed, right? ETH Bitcoin bottomed here on the ETH USD chart, and ETH USD did not go to new all-time highs until after that happened. Even in 2016, right? This was also kind of a similar cycle as the 2016 cycle in terms of these like triple tops. It wasn't until ETH Bitcoin bottomed right here in December of 2016, right? It was when ETH Bitcoin bottomed right there that allowed ETH USD to durably go to new all-time highs. So you want to see ETH Bitcoin bottom to allow ETH USD to then theoretically go to new all-time highs. But as long as ETH Bitcoin is in that downtrend, anytime ETH rallies up to 4K, the market just sells off because people are going to be like, well, if the market's going to go up, it's only going to go up because ETH will only go up because Bitcoin's going up. And if Bitcoin's the reason ETH goes up, then why not just own Bitcoin? That's always been the argument. And that's why ETH Bitcoin keeps going down, because a lot of people are thinking that way, right? If the only way that ETH goes up on its USD pair is if Bitcoin goes up first, what's the point of holding ETH, right? Just hold Bitcoin. In order for that to reverse in a durable fashion, you have to have pain on ETH USD. And if you get pain on it, the Fed will pivot. And then the risk to reward becomes more attractive for Ethereum. A lot of people think ETH is dead because of this pattern, but really this is still the same pattern that happened over here in 2016. It's taking longer. It's taking longer, but it's the same pattern. Just on a larger scale. Same pattern as 2019. Just on a larger scale. And the confirmation that it's a similar pattern as compared to 2019 is just the sobering look at alt Bitcoin pairs, right? The sobering reality of truly what has happened to alt Bitcoin pairs. Guys, it is February of 2025 and alt Bitcoin pairs just put in a new low, right? There was never a time this cycle where alt Bitcoin pairs were actually bullish in a durable fashion. They were all rallies that were nothing more than bear market rallies for alt Bitcoin pairs. So I think confirmation that it's playing out in a similar fashion to 2019, 2020, 2021 through the lens of monetary policy is that alt Bitcoin pairs continue to go lower, and maybe they continue to go lower because they never went to the range lows. And because they never went to the range lows, the Fed never had to end quantitative tightening. I'm not saying the Fed cares about crypto, but I do think crypto gives you an insight into the sort of the amount of excess liquidity in the markets, and the lower alt Bitcoin pairs go, that means liquidity is drying up and Bitcoin dominance goes higher. The higher Bitcoin dominance goes, the more likely it is the Fed will eventually pivot. Remember, the higher dominance goes, theoretically, the better a future alt season will be. But you don't really get alt season until quantitative tightening is over. The real story is after all these years, ETH USD has finally entered into its lower logarithmic regression trend line. Guys, it's been a long journey to get here. And my only advice is don't let it go to waste, right? Don't let it go to waste. I don't know exactly where ETH USD is going to bottom, but if it does form a macro higher low, like it did sort of like over here last cycle, don't let it go to waste. And we've seen that pattern many, many times on other assets as well. In fact, Tesla did something very similar, and I've made that correlation a few times, but I think a lot of you guys are also familiar and you like following the Tesla stock price as well. I mean, I like Tesla as a company, and I made some mistakes with that one because I was right about it over here. I was really bullish on it. I turned bearish on it actually in 2022. My main mistake with Tesla was I didn't pivot here, and it also formed that higher low structure. But guess what? When it broke, it formed a macro higher low. I didn't wait for it to take out this low. I just said it's time to flip bullish right here on the macro higher low. And then guess what happened? Tesla went to all-time highs. So you could argue that ETH is going to follow a similar playbook. It breaks the higher low structure, forms a macro higher low around the time of that quantitative tightening ends, and then it goes to all-time highs. Maybe that's the way the cycle will play out. And then maybe later on in the year, early next year, you'll see sort of the unemployment rate really go higher. And then perhaps we have to deal with a recession in the typical midterm year, just like 2014, 2018, 2022. Maybe the recession, maybe the bear market narrative for 2026 will just be a recession. Who knows? But there's always a reason for everything. It's always easy to explain it in hindsight. I am here to at least try to show you the most likely path based on what's happening with monetary policy. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But hopefully, hopefully some people at least were able to, be aware that this move could easily happen with the Bank of Japan raising rates last month and seeing similar capitulations after the Bank of Japan raised rates in the last couple of times. So those are my thoughts, guys, on the market. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and here we are. Ethereum finally went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.